Good morning. My name is Phil Adamo. I'm a history professor here at Augsburg College, and on behalf of President Paul Pribenow and Provost Karen Kaivala, I want to welcome you to the 2013 Humanities and Fine Arts Convocation. Thanks for coming. Today, the Rose Ensemble returns to Augsburg College. They've performed here many times, and what you may not know is, although they're sort of our neighborhood early music group here in the Twin Cities, they're actually acclaimed throughout the world. A year ago, they were at a choral competition in Tolosa, Spain, where only 16 choirs performed. Only one choir from the United States was invited, the Rose Ensemble, and they ended up winning first place in the choral competition for secular and sacred music. I want to just alert you to the fact that there are two performances of the entire presentation of Trujillo, Portraits of Peru. It's a fantastic concert. It's happening in this space on Friday and Saturday night. If you're an Augsburg student with an ID, the tickets are only $10. If you're an Augsburg staff or faculty member and you call the Rose Ensemble office, you can get tickets for $15. That's almost half of what the tickets normally cost. So we'd really appreciate it if you come back, if you like the presentation today, which is going to be some of the pieces that you'll hear at the concert, but some of the history of the manuscript, where this music comes from, some of the background of the instruments, and that sort of thing. There's a pre-show presentation as well at 7 o'clock. The concert starts at 8. That's on Friday and Saturday night in this space. At the end of the program today, there'll be about 10 or 12 minutes for some questions, so please stay for that if you can. And then at 11:30, we're having lunch with all of these wonderful musicians in the East Commons. And it's almost full, there are some spaces left, but if you'd like to join us, please see me before you leave. Let me now welcome Tom Zajac and the Rose Ensemble.
Su questo che sto c'è buena, farò cantare Thank you very much. Good morning, and we're pleased to be here today to perform for you and to explain the music and the historical background a bit. The two pieces we just heard are the first two pieces of a manuscript that we'll be talking about at length. But I first want to give you the translations of the pieces because they're very interesting. They're both Christmas songs. We're a little early for that, but if the department stores can have their Christmas decorations up already, I think we can already play a Christmas tune or two. The first song is, the text says, it's in Spanish, and the translation is, "Give us permissions, sirs, since it is Christmas Eve, to sing and dance in the custom of our lands." And the second one says, "This child is the best that can be obtained. My soul, my humble heart, to show you how much I care for you, I have brought to you all my love. Ah, Jesus, so lovely, my child, you are the one. Ah, Jesus, my Father, my God, you are the greatest." And there's a couple of very interesting things already in this text that I'll point out and then we'll illuminate on it later. The first one is curious because it says to the audience, "Give us permission, sir, since it is Christmas, to sing and dance in the custom of our lands." Now, who is the person whose voice is being spoken saying the custom of our lands? Well, we think it is the mestizo people of the region where this manuscript comes from, who is speaking to the pure-blood Spaniards, who are the upper-class people. And then in the second text, it ends with the word achalai, which is a Nahuatl word, which translates as the greatest or you're awesome. And the fact that they insert an Indian word into this otherwise Spanish text shows you that there's already a mixture of Native American and Spanish. So let me now go back and describe this manuscript and the historical background to it. Between the years of 1782 and 85, the bishop of what was then the northern part of the Peruvian viceroyalty, or the Lima viceroyalty, his name was Bishop Baltazar Jaime Martinez Compañón. They all had long names at that time. And he was a Spanish-born, very highly educated bishop who was assigned to this region. It was not the best assignment for someone of his stature, but he took it bravely. And one of his first assignments when he arrived there was to do what was called a visita. And that was to take a long trip all around the area that encompassed his region and visit all the little pueblos, the towns and villages. This part, if you can picture the Pacific coast of South America, this is what is now the very northern part of Peru, south of Ecuador. And it's a very narrow part of the coastal region. So you have the coastal area, you have the high plains, you have the mountains, and the mountains go up into very dense rainforests. And all of this was part of the region that he went on this trip with. He brought on this trip a few people, his secretary Pedro de Echevarri, a missionary, a chaplain, a notary, a scribe, a Spaniard named Antonio de Narbona, his nephew Jose de Lacuanda, and 6 slaves to service the group. Of course, at that time, you had to have your slaves with you to carry packs and to prepare food and things like that. The purpose of the visit was to collect information about these different villages and different regions. One of the things that was done was that there was a questionnaire that the bishop brought with him, and every town had to fill this questionnaire out. And the questionnaire had very utilitarian purposes. This was a period in the history of Spain, in the history of the church at this time, where they were very interested in reformation of the church. They wanted the Indian slaves and the African slaves to be treated much better than they were treated before. They wanted to organize society in a much more constructive way. And not surprisingly, they also wanted to reap the profits of the products that were mined and the plants that were planted and all of the things that were harvested from the forests and the animals and plants, and get the most out of those that they could. So they had this questionnaire that was brought to every village as they went around on this visita. And the questionnaire had questions about geography, metallurgy, mineralogy, and botany. And questions such as, are there any medicinal herbs, branches, or fruits? And if there are, what are their shapes, and what are their virtues of each of them, and the mode of applying them and using them? So they really wanted to get as much information about all these stuff that they could collect and send back to Spain. One in particular was balsams. Balsams derived from the aromatic resins of trees and shrubs, which could have medicinal applications as well as just beautiful scents. So one of the main way that this visita was manifested was in the collection of 9 volumes of watercolor paintings. And in fact, whatever writings were taken down at this time are tragically lost. Or it's possible that the bishop never got around to doing it because he soon was assigned to a new bishopric in Bogota, what is now Bogota, Colombia. So he may never have written down the information. But we do have these 9 volumes of watercolor paintings, and they're housed in the Royal Library in Madrid. They're still there today. The 9 volumes, and I'll just go through them, so it's very interesting how they're delineated. Volume 1 is Maps, Plans, and Portraits of Church Functionaries. Volume 2 is All Sorts of People, the various social strata called castas, pictures of people working in the fields and various other types of work, people worshiping in church, people playing games, some of which are very recognizable, like badminton, and others which we have no idea what types of games they are. And then at the very end, pictures of dancing and music, and we'll get back to that in just a moment. Volume 3 has plants and herbs. Volume 4, trees, fruits, seeds, and leaves. Volume 5, other types of various herbs. And these 3 volumes together were perhaps the most valuable from the purpose of the king, because it showed watercolor images of 488 individual plants, trees, and bushes, many of which had value for medicinal purposes. And then volume 6 was mammals, insects, and lizards. Volume 7, birds and bats. Volume 8, fish and other sea creatures. And volume 9, archaeological specimens. So coming back to volume 2, and specifically the end of volume 2, where it has pictures of musicians and dancers, we get, for our purposes as players of early music from the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, we're always looking for ways to find valuable information that can help us create, flesh out the music and make it live, because we normally have so little information to go on. But here in this volume, we have these wonderful, very vivid, very essential watercolor paintings that show how the players held the instruments, how the dancers danced, in what formation they danced, what kind of costumes the dancers danced in. So it's quite wonderful. But what makes it really quite special is that next to all of these images of the dancers and musicians are fly leaves containing 20 pieces of music, 17 songs and 3 dances. So the 2 pieces you just heard are the first 2 pieces from that collection of 20. And just like the bishop and his group are going around to the different villages and pueblos collecting information from the people, they also were collecting the songs that were popular in those particular regions. So these pieces are not composed in the conventional sense of someone sitting down and writing a piece, coming out of his head. These are pieces that were transcribed by listening to players in a particular village. If this were done in the 20th century, and in fact it was done in the early part of the 20th century by, who knows Bela Bartok, the composer Bela Bartok? Yeah, he, besides being a great composer, he also was a collector of music in the Balkan region of Eastern Europe. And in the early part of the 20th century, he went around with a very old style recording device, a cylinder recorder, and recorded all the people in the different regions. And he also had someone with him who took photographs of the people as they were being recorded. If Bishop Martinez Compagnon had those devices in the end of the 18th century, he would have used recording equipment and flash photography rather than writing things down with pen and paper or making paintings. So it was documentation of what was going on at that time. Very fascinating. Within this collection of 20, you see examples of the music of all the different racial types of the time. Now you have to know at this time it's before the revolution, just actually a little bit before the revolution, which took place at the beginning of the 19th century. So you have groups of people that are very much kind of isolated in certain areas. They didn't travel all that much. And then in this very particular region of northern Peru, you have African slaves who are mostly working in the coastal regions, but some of them were working up a little bit further into the hills and mountains. You have Native Americans, the indigenous people. You have pure blood Spanish in two categories, in two levels of society. If you were born in Spain and came to the New World to work, you were peninsulares. And if you were of Spanish pure blood but were born in the New World, you were criollos. And those had two distinct levels. You were considered inferior if you were born in the New World. And then, of course, there's all the possible combinations of Spaniards and native-born, and Spanish and African American, and African and native-born. And each one of those categories, down to the 8th level, had particular names. And that whole system was called the castas system. And we have that in the United States as well. In the South, in the 1920s and 30s, we were very conscious about that. Gladly, we're not as aware of that today, or not as concerned about that today. How much of 1% or 25% or 12.5% of what racial type you are. But in Spain, they were consumed with that idea. So in these various villages, there was music coming from different groups. And what we'd like to do for you now is to play first a very pure Native American piece. It's also from Trujillo del Peru manuscript, and it's called Tonada del Chimo. Let me, as they're setting up, let me give you the translation of this. It's a Christian text, even though it's a Native American sounding piece, and it's in a native language called Mochica. Satan enters in the soul, into the house of the soul where one sins. The nails in the body are removed from the soul. If this is done, they will be forgiven by our beloved Jesus Christ, whose blood was spilled for us. You enter crying with the soul, with the body. There is much to be forgiven, says our heart. So, sort of a penitential text. Next, we'll hear a piece from the Trujillo del Peru manuscript that is very strongly of an African element. I wish I could say that there was a piece that had actual surviving African language, like we just heard the Native American language, but there are no pieces from the New World that have retained complete text or even phrases of African. There are some pieces that have little bits of African elements, and scholars tend to think that they're just made up to sound like African rather than real African phrases. But this next piece has a very interesting text nonetheless. It's called El Congo, and the Congo, of course, is a real place in Africa where slaves were brought over to the New World. And this piece, give me 1 second to find the text. This piece is in the voice of an African slave who is not happy with having been brought over. He says, "To the sea they carried me off without just cause, making me leave my mother whom I loved. Hey, thus says the Congo, that is his orders, says the Congo. Kusuku, go see. Kusuku, go. There's nothing new. For the," and then we have these words, "Palo de la jeringa," goes right to the spot. Now, for a long time, we didn't really know what palo de jeringa is. And in fact, there's still some arguments about it. Some people feel it's a corruption of the word gringo, meaning white man. So the text then would be interpreted as the stick of the white man goes right to the spot, meaning he beats us. But just recently, a colleague of mine where I teach was listening to some testimonials of Cuban slaves that were taped in the 1920s. Slavery lasted a lot longer in Cuba than it did in the United States. And these were slaves who were still alive and were able to document in interviews their experiences as slaves. And this one guy was talking about how, in order to dull their senses from the pain of being entrapped in slavery, they took this herb called palo de jeringa. And all of a sudden we went, wow, that's what they're talking about, or at least that's what we think they're talking about. So it's not the slave owner at all, it's the experience of being in an uncomfortable, painful situation and having some herb that you can take to just kind of numb out. So, but you would never know but by listening to this piece, because it's a very jolly sounding piece. So we're going to do for you Tonada el Congo. Thank you. And of course, the other major ethnic group was the Spaniards, or the whites. And there was a lot of music, probably the majority of the music, represented their ethnic personality and their interests. And we're going to represent that sound with a piece from a different manuscript from Bolivia. That's actually it's a collection of fragments of manuscript called the Mochos Archives. And it's from what is now an Indian area. There's various Indian tribes there. But missionaries came in very early and brought their European influence. The piece is called a folias, but the folia itself is a dance that has a particular sound, which sounds like this. It has that kind of chordal bass pattern. And the piece that the violins are going to play, which is called a folia, has nothing to do with that. So we don't quite know why it's called that, except I think the composer just liked the sound of the name folia. And it's actually two movements, but they're just going to be playing the largo, the slow movements. And you'll see that this sounds nothing like the Indian or African music we've heard. It's very European sounding. So you might say that it's rather remarkable that all of these very distinctly different sounds are happening simultaneously in South America. And what happens is these different elements continue to cross-pollinate and create a very blended sound, so that by the time we get to the 21st century, we have what we think of today as Peruvian or Andean music, which is, really a blend of these things, so much so that you can't tell what's what anymore. But at the end of the 18th century, the elements were still distinct enough so that you could hear what's Indian, what's African, what's European. We're going to continue. I'm just going to talk briefly about the instruments we're playing, because many of them I'm sure, are very familiar to you, but some are slightly unfamiliar, or perhaps completely unfamiliar. Going from your left to right, you just heard violins in the Baroque style of violins, which are slightly different, and they have gut strings rather than metal strings. The neck length is a little bit shorter. The bow is more pointy to get a more bouncy and edgy sound. We have next to them, Patty's holding, why don't you stand up, viola da gamba, which is a kind of a relative of the cello, 6 strings instead of 4, and the same type of bow, a pointed bow, and other differences. Danny's playing all sorts of percussion instruments, including, you'll see at the end, he does some crazy stuff with his feet. Or no, were we doing that piece? We might get to that piece. Anyway, he's playing all sorts of percussion instruments. 2 instruments that were particular to Peru was this called the cajita, which means the little box. And it was played, you'd hang it from your neck, and one hand would open and close the cover, and the other hand would hit it with a stick, so you get various rhythms. And it's thought that it was invented by the slaves. Their instruments were taken away from them by the slave owners, and so they had to make do with whatever they could come to. The cajita was probably originally an alms box for church that someone snuck out of the church and they made into an instrument. A related instrument, and a much more popular, in fact, this is an extremely popular instrument in all sorts of musics today, especially in flamenco. It's called the cajon, which means the big box. And this, again, was probably originally made by slaves from boxes for shipping. And just whacking it on the side, you can get all kinds of different sounds. So, almost like playing a conga. And we also had the ass's jaw, which actually is made from the jaw of an ass, and you just scrape it with a stick. We'll go on. And to my left is the Spanish double harp, interesting and different from other European-style harps because it actually has 2 sets of strings that cross each other, so that in order to play one set of strings you play up here, and on one set of strings you play down here, it allows you to play fully chromatic. Very difficult, devilishly difficult instrument, but Paul is a master. And then various types of guitar and related guitar instruments. We have the guitar as it was in the 18th century, sometimes called the Baroque guitar. Next to him Scott's holding a large instrument called the theorbo, which was from the lute family, and it had extended strings which allowed for extra bass notes down at the very bottom. And then a little instrument that many of the South American guitar types, all sorts of experiments. This is called a charango, and it has a really nice high pitch. It was sometimes made out of an armadillo shell, but they stopped making it out of armadillo because it's not politically correct. Okay, we'll continue now with one other instrumental piece before we take a question and answer period. Why don't we do La Lanchas? So if you need to stand up to see what Danny's doing with his feet, I advise it. Many of the pieces in the program have descriptive titles, which tell what town they came from, and if it's good for dancing or not, and how many dancers sometimes. Lots of good information, which also helps us decide how to perform these pieces. So this is just called Lanchas para bailar, which means lanchas for dancing. And we don't know what lanchas is. It might be a type of dance. The only Spanish word that's possible is a lancha is like a pleasure craft, a yacht, but that doesn't seem to be a possible description of it, so we don't know. We have one more piece to play for you, but we'd like to open it up for any questions you might have about the music or the manuscript, the group. Nothing too personal. But...
Any questions? I have a microphone for you so you can be well heard.
You didn't say anything about the guitar. Is that a South American version of the guitar, or?
This is basically what the guitar looked like throughout Europe and all of the Spanish colonies in the 18th century. So it sort of grew over time. In the 16th century, it looked more like the ukulele, if you can imagine that, quite small. And in fact, the guitar being brought to Hawaii by sailors from Europe is how the ukulele came about. And this is sort of the midpoint between that and the modern guitar. So the only difference is slightly smaller, and it has 5 pairs of strings rather than 6 single strings. And it was pretty much used throughout the Spanish-speaking world all through this period. So it's not particular to South America, although there are versions of this instrument that still exist as folk instruments throughout Latin America.
What does your sheet music look like?
It's
Like, is it super like elaborate? Like, is there a ton
Well,
on all the
actually, she asked, what does the sheet music look like? And in fact, if you read music, you would immediately be able to recognize it. By the time of the 18th century, it's very modern looking. The thing I would say is that it's because it's written to just be a document of what they heard, it's very skeletal. So all you have pretty much are a treble line with the words, a bass line. Sometimes there's figures which tell you what chords to play over the bass, but most often not. You have maybe a few little indications, like there might be something that says allegro or largo to tell you what speed to play, but that's it. So if you played just what was on the page, it would sound very boring. So you have to, what I did was I added parts, like if it was a 1-part piece, I made it into a 2-part piece by adding an extra part. I added, of course we added a whole bunch of percussion to this, which it wasn't in the original, except for one fun exception. There's one piece, that the Indian piece, the first piece you heard, that was sung so beautifully by Kim, all you had as an accompaniment was the gamba going boom, 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 and the bass player was going boom, boom, boom. That's actually written in the original, as if they needed to write that, but they really wanted to make sure they documented what was in the village, playing in the village. So if you want, if you come up, I can show you what it looks like.
I was just wondering, your instruments are like slightly different from modern instruments, I guess, or I don't know how different, but did you guys have to learn how to play them, or did you guys already know before? And
Why don't you answer?
that's a question for a lot of you, I guess.
Tom asked me to answer this, and I feel that I can't really speak for everybody because our instruments are so different. In my case, this harp is a copy of a harp from 1704, and there are only a handful of us in North America with these instruments that know how to play them. I started playing the modern orchestral pedal harp and quickly abandoned that in favor of the historical instruments just because I'd always had a big love for that kind of music. But it's pretty obscure and pretty esoteric. We need to have different instruments, at least in the harp's case, for different repertoires. So I don't know if this is speaking to us.
Right?
Sorry?
All the instruments are replicas.
Yeah.
All of our instruments, I think, without question, there might be is there an old violin? So one of the violinists is playing an instrument probably from the early 18th century? 1749. There are builders in this country who we buy our instruments from. It's not like they come off the production line. They're at least certainly the string instruments, the guitars, they're commissioned. So you would contact a builder. And string makers, so the gut strings, again, you don't go to Walmart and buy gut strings. There is a very well-known creator of gut strings who lives in Duluth, Dan Larson. So he makes a lot of the strings that we use, coincidentally. And the percussion instruments, maybe you can...
Well, you know, percussion instruments haven't changed so much over the years. They just got a little more economical with their building, but they have the calf skins and rope tension instead of just, you know, metal tuning key. And but basically the idea is the same. There's, you know, when you play early percussion, most of the time you're dealing with ethnic instruments and different traditions that are still being played today. But as far as learning how to play, you know, modern versus old, there's someone in the group who actually plays both modern and ancient instruments.
So I'm very new to Baroque. I was a modern violinist for I still am, for 20 years, and I've been playing Baroque violin for only a year and a month. So I'm very new to it, and the difference is pretty big for me. First of all, I don't have the modern violin chin rest or shoulder rest, and that creates a different posture for my neck, being quite long. I'm not sure where to put my neck sometimes. I mean my chin. And so just firstly, holding the instrument was a challenge for me. But I've found a sort of setup that works, that doesn't distort my body so much. The other main difference is that having the violin resting mainly in my hand means that shifting is quite difficult for me, and in the beginning it was, I guess, because modern violin sits so comfortably with the weight of your head balancing it that you can shift very fast. But now without that, I sort of find myself climbing around on the instrument and hoping not to drop it when I'm shifting back and forth. And then another big difference is the bow. So because of its shape, it's shaped more like a bow and arrow bow. It doesn't rest as easily on the strings, so you have to have a slower pull. And being a modern violinist, that's sort of really hard to do because you just want to go really fast, and so you have to slow yourself down to get the best sound possible. And a friend of mine is doing a thesis on Baroque instruments and how the instrument might inform your playing of the different styles. And I find that to be a big impact because the bow just does so many different things because of its shape. It bounces more easily, and some of the patterns you see in early music require that, and the modern bow wouldn't allow for that. It's more difficult to play early music on a modern instrument than it is to play on a Baroque instrument.
I think we have time for one more question, and I saw a musician back here who had a question.
I was really curious about your process in determining your choice of ornamentation and embellishments, and I think some of it's been answered by the actual physicality and the limitations of the instruments itself. But have you gone through with either going with contemporary written accounts as well as listening to modern folk practices of the instruments themselves? And how would you all determine, are you all using the same, process in your ensemble?
Well, actually, all of the above. I mean, one of the interesting things about this manuscript is that it contains some bits of ornamentation which mostly look like grace notes. And the singers have been discovering that some of them work rather nicely and others just don't make any sense at all. So I gave them the directive to abandon whatever ornaments don't work or change them to make them work. I've listened to a lot of traditional music from South America to help inform the way we're performing and presenting the music. Some of it's rather simple because there are real strong ties between some of the pieces in the manuscript and some of the modern practices. For example, there's one piece that you didn't hear today, but you'll hear when you come to our concerts, that is tied to the tradition of the Yaraví, which is a very passionate song in Peru and Bolivia. And it's clear that it's the ancestor of that modern style. So if you can extrapolate backwards from the traditions that are being still done today, with a grain of salt, of course, always, because so much has happened in the last 200 years, you can actually, I think, very effectively use modern practices, folk practices. So we're going to play one more piece for you, and then we'd like to invite you to come up and take a look at instruments more closely if you would like. Otherwise, we'll see you at one of our 2 concerts here. So thanks for being a great audience. This is a piece that has a real macho text. It's basically basically saying, I'm invincible. Of bronze I am made, of diamond, of ruby. It is death that fears me. I do not fear death.